Hi everyone, it's an honour to bring a message to you today. I have a simple question for you to begin with. Simply, how are you? How are you doing? We are about a year into this pandemic. We're about a year into our lives being turned upside down. How are you? With that, how are your family? How's your mum or your dad? How are they doing? How's your brothers or your sisters, their families? Perhaps how are your kids? How are they getting on? How are your co-workers, the people you work alongside every day, albeit online at the moment? How are they doing through this lockdown? It's fair to say that there are a lot of emotions out there. The emotional and psychological impact of this crisis have been huge. And I don't know how you're feeling either today or how you have been feeling through some of this pandemic. Maybe scared, maybe fearful at times, afraid, maybe at times lonely, maybe at times even angry. I don't know what it is that you've been feeling, but you're not alone. I want to take us today to a couple of thousand years to the life of the Apostle Paul, and particularly a point in his life where he and the people around him would have been experiencing very similar emotions in the midst of a chaotic situation. We're going to be looking at the end of the book of Acts, almost the end of Paul's life actually. And we're going to be in Acts chapter 27. If you're able to get a Bible open, I think that would be really helpful so we can track along together. Acts chapter 27. Paul is in a boat with his friends and he's on the way to Rome, the centre of the known world at that time, the centre of the Roman Empire, because he has appealed to Caesar. He's standing trial for the hope of the gospel. And so he's been taken prisoner on board a boat and he's headed to Rome. He's in the middle of the sea. And let's see what happens. Chaotic events begin to unfold. So we'll pick up the story in Acts chapter 27. Turn there with me if you can, and we're going to be beginning in verse 14. Verse 14. But before long, there rushed down from the land a violent wind called Euraquilo. And when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. Running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables in undergirding the ship. And fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be driven along. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo, and on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. All hope of our being saved was being gradually abandoned. Does that sound familiar? I mean, imagine the situation with me. They are in the middle of the ocean. The sea is stormy. The ship is being rocked about all over the place. People are scared. People are frightened for their very lives. Does that sound even a little bit familiar? It's a chaotic situation. Chaos is unraveling all round them, and people do strange things when they're scared. I guess the situation is very relevant to our days. I guess the question really is how God is going to choose to act in the middle of a chaotic situation. And particularly, how is God going to work through his disciples? In this case, the Apostle Paul and his friends. How is God going to work through his disciples in a chaotic situation? How might he want to work through us in the middle of such despair? It says all hope was gradually abandoned. And I don't know about you, but it seems very similar in these days. or it has done at least in periods during the pandemic, hasn't it? All hope. Hope is at an all-time low. Maybe certainly for the people around us, maybe for us at times, hope is at an all-time low. How will God work at this time, and how is God calling us to act at this time? Let's read on in Acts chapter 27. We'll continue from verse 21 if you want to read along with me. When they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong and to whom I serve stood before me, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul, for you must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island.'" In the midst of a sea of despair, Paul stands up, takes courage, and gives courage to those around him. In a situation where Paul could easily have despaired and just thought about himself. After all, he was a prisoner. He was on board a ship. He was in the middle of the ocean where he hadn't chosen to be. He could easily have just thought of himself. I'm sure at times he was scared himself as well. And yet he took courage, he stood up, and he gave courage to those around him. He spoke words of truth. He spoke words of life to those around us. Our times are very different. Our situation is different, but the God we serve is exactly the same. He is calling us to stand up, to speak up, and to speak words of life and courage to those around us. Let's read on and see what does happen next in Acts chapter 27. We'll read on from verse 27. "But when the 14th night came, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors began to surmise that we were approaching some land. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and a little farther on they took another sounding and found it to be about 15 fathoms. Fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, 'Unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved.' Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away." So in fear for their very lives, these sailors, these experienced sailors, see that they are on a sinking ship. And sadly, they do what a lot of people would have done in that situation. They think only of themselves. They try and take the ship's boat and try and take it for themselves to safety. Fear causes men and women to do strange things, doesn't it? And I think we've seen that through this pandemic. Now, it's true that the news is full of stories of this pandemic, this crisis, bringing people together in beautiful ways. And that's true and so good, and we should be thankful for that. But the fear of this pandemic has also caused people at times, maybe, to turn inwards, to think of ourselves, to think of me and my family, to think of my needs, to self-isolate, as it were. I know we've seen that maybe in the people around us, and maybe at times it's been true for us too. Certainly I know it has been for me. It's easy to turn inwards at these times, to think only of our own needs, in a sense to panic buy, to buy the stuff or all off the shelves that we need without thinking that that might mean there's less left for others. The question then is how God might act in this situation. How might God choose to work through believers in a time of crisis, in a time where we might easily turn inwards and think only of ourselves? How does God work back then in the life of Paul? How will God work now through our lives when everyone is hurting in some way? Let's read on and see. I'm going to read on from verse 33. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you've been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore I encourage you to take some food, for this is your preservation. For not a hair from the head of any of you will perish." Having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. All of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. Paul, in the midst of terrific suffering himself, somehow, and this really impresses me, somehow manages to look out of himself and think about others. He thinks about the group. He thinks about these everyone else on the ship with him, hundreds actually of people, soldiers and sailors, rough guys, a lot of them, violent soldiers, rough sailors, most of who were not believers. Paul chooses to look out of himself and cares for them, not just their physical lives, but their eternal futures. You see again and again that one of the main ways that Paul cares for them in this passage is that he doesn't hold back from speaking about the truths of the gospel. He doesn't hold back from speaking about the truths about God, the reality of his faith, the reality of the God he serves. And it is to be exactly the same for us. I'm praying for a boldness and a courage for us, for me and for you in these days. An ability to speak the truths of the gospel in such difficult and hard times when people need the words of life. They need true encouragement. We are called to be beacons of hope in a sea of despair. Beacons of hope in a sea of despair. We can't do this in our own strength. We are scared and frightened too at times. We are fearful and afraid. We are lonely. Sometimes we are angry and afraid. But daily, you and I don't know if you've experienced this, but I'm praying you would, are experiencing and receiving this comfort from God. That comfort has a purpose. That comfort is then to be shed abroad. That comfort is to be given out to those who don't have comfort. Many of the people on board with Paul and his companions were not believers. But I wouldn't be at all surprised by the end of that journey if many of them were. They had heard of the truth of the gospel. And I'm praying that would be true for us, that many around us would hear the good words of life from our lips. Let's pray together. Father, I just ask for opportunities for the Gospels in these strange and difficult and hard times. I ask that you would use us, men and women, young and old, every sphere of society, every even culture among us, that you would reach men and women through us, that you would reach families through us, that in these difficult times you would cause us to be beacons of hope in a sea of despair. Father, we confess that often we are feeling a certain level of despair ourselves, sometimes small, sometimes huge. But Father, ultimately, Jesus Christ, you are a rock of hope. You are our beacon of hope in a sea of despair, and you cause us to be the same. You cause us to shed hope into the lives of those around us, and I ask that you would do that during these days. Thank you so much for listening today. Be blessed, be encouraged, I pray. Take heart. God is for us and not against us. He's given us such goodness even in this times, and he's going to reach through us to those around us who are without hope. Thanks so much for listening. Cheers.